Your name is Tomaso di Camogli, and today is the most important and possibly the last day of your life. Your service as a mercenary with King Philip of France has brought you here to some quiet farm fields outside a village that the locals call Crecy. The order to advance is just sounded, and you exchange confused looks with your fellow Genoese crossbowmen. Surely they know that you're tired from marching all day and dangerously under-equipped without your protective pavis. But eventually, your professionalism and pride win out and you advance, if reluctantly. Little do you know that today will see the advent of two new weapons to the continental battlefield, and that you'll be on the receiving end of both. Today on the Warfighter Archives, we'll continue examining the age-old debate of longbow versus crossbow, covering the events of the archery duel at Crecy. This battle is often cited as proof of the longbow's dominance, but in reality it is much more complicated than that. In my previous video, we discussed who the Genoese were and what equipment they carried and didn't carry for that matter. Today, we'll discuss the actual battle itself, and we'll continue to do so in part through the eyes of Tomaso, our fictional Genoese crossbowman. Tomaso might wonder why King Philip would order the advance knowing how tired and ill-prepared the Genoese were, but the reality is that King Philip may have never wanted to advance at all. Originally, the French had sent 4 knights to conduct a reconnaissance of the battlefield, and the 4 had recommended they rest and wait for the next day. Originally, King Philip seems to have accepted this decision along with all his senior officers. However, as we discussed in the last video, the French army itself was dangerously undisciplined. Knights were leaving their place in the order of march, crowding forward onto the battlefield, and the royal officers seemed powerless to stop them. Froissart depicts this clearly when the French ceased to be an army and became an armed mob. The commoners, quote, took their swords and cried, "Down with them! Let us slay them all!" The knights rode in such disarray that neither the king nor his marshals could rule them, and Froissart states that no man, though they were present, could imagine or show the truth of the evil order that was among the French party. This creates a scene of literally unimaginable confusion and chaos. Commoners are waving weapons, demanding that the knights charge, knights jockey for position, some trying to fall back and make camp as the king had ordered, others pushing forward because they wanted blood just as much as the commoners did. The king's officers are trying vainly to shout commands and maintain order, and undisciplined armies like this have a dangerous tendency to take on a mind of their own. In this situation, the writing was on the wall. The knights were going to charge regardless of what King Philip or anyone else wanted. To save face, it's entirely likely that the king would have ordered the attack. Perhaps he hoped that his superior numbers could carry the day, or maybe he just believed that it was better to give a bad order than to be seen as powerless and without authority. This would be especially true in front of the 2 allied kings. Both King John of Bohemia and his son King Charles of the Romans were present in the vanguard. Or it's possible that the king himself was caught up in the madness and mob mentality that had overtaken the rest of his army. We'll never really know. What we do know is that an advance was ordered. The crossbowmen began their advance along a narrow front aimed at the Prince of Wales's division. Why they advanced on a narrow front is a matter of debate. However, in 2005, Sir Philip Preston discovered that the Vallée des Clercs, which covered most of the English line, was very steep, almost vertical in 1346. The only realistic approach would have been through a 300-meter or so gap between the River Mayo and the Vallée des Clercs' eastern end. This would have been the area defended by the Prince of Wales and his division. Froissart states that the crossbowmen advanced in 3, quote, great leaps, each accompanied by a yell. This was likely the crossbowmen led by the Genoese professionals advancing about 50 meters or so, then stopping to regroup and ensure their line was dressed before advancing again. Each yell was likely a call and respond to halt one advance and order the next. In modern militaries, we still do this with some of our marching commands, especially in larger formations, and it is somewhere around this event that we hit our first major controversy. At some point, either just before or during the advance, a rainstorm blew across the battlefield. Chroniclers make it clear that this storm was unusual for its suddenness and the amount of rain, and state that this heavy rain ruined the crossbow strings. Meanwhile, longbowmen simply unstrung their bows and placed the bowstrings in their helmets for protection. Modern historians and reenactors have debated this, as crossbowmen, especially the Genoese professionals, would have had a waterproof leather covering for their crossbows. The line of thought runs that the Genoese could simply have covered their crossbows and kept them dry, and on the surface that makes sense. But what if the rainstorm blew up when the advance was about to begin, or when it had already begun? Remember, this is depicted as a very sudden storm that came out of nowhere. As Tomaso, with the enemy a couple hundred meters away, would you really stop, pull out the cover, unroll it, and wrap your crossbow up, meaning it couldn't be fired? Would you even have time to do this in the face of a sudden storm with no warning? Remember, you'd then have to uncase the bow, re-roll the case, and stow it again, all with the enemy staring down at you, possibly within arrow range, depending on where in the advance you were. Would this even be a good idea? What if the English advanced suddenly on you while your crossbow was cased? This would be a very bad situation, as you'd be unable to respond quickly. Either way, the rainstorm cleared, and another factor now took hold. The late afternoon sun was now firmly behind the English, shining right into the eyes of the Genoese. Remember that a crossbow is ideally aimed directly at the target. This means that the Genoese would have had to sight in while staring at the sun, and I think we can all see how this would have a huge effect, not just on their aim, but their ability to even identify targets in the first place. Honestly, I'm not sure why this isn't brought up in every discussion of Crecy, because it might be one of the most important factors involved. Still, the Genoese advanced until they were within about 150 meters of the English archers, according to David Nicole. This is well within the range of the longbow, as well as most, if not all, the crossbows. Froissart is clear that the Genoese stopped here and shot their first volley. At this point, the English longbowmen shot their own bows. Why they waited for so long is a matter for more debate. Tell me what you think in the comments below, but my thought is that there were two factors involved. One, they probably had unstrung their bows due to the rain and therefore had to string them again. In addition, the English commanders probably wanted the Genoese to get closer to conserve ammunition. The English had issued all of their available arrows, 3 quivers or around 72 arrows per archer. While this might seem like a lot, so did 210 rounds of ammunition in Iraq, and I found out that I could shoot through a lot of that in about 15 minutes of a firefight. Froissart and others make it clear that shooting speed was a factor here. As I discussed in my video on Longbowmen, the standard shooting rate in Tudor times was around 4 to 5 arrows per minute, but it's also almost certain that Longbowmen could shoot faster if needed. And there were 6,000 Longbowmen shooting, assuming the reserve division didn't engage. Even if we assumed the rate of 4, that would be 24,000 arrows in a minute. In my eyes, that would be more than enough to justify Froissart's description of, quote, so wholly together and so thick it seemed like snow. Meanwhile, even if the crossbowmen somehow did the unpack, cover, uncover, repack dance, they were shooting with the sun directly in their eyes up a hill. Under these circumstances, even the best marksmen like Tomaso would find it almost impossible to take good aimed shots. In addition, the English also discharged several cannons at the Genoese. Modern historians debate the overall effect. However, the Italian chronicler Villani states that the Genoese were subjected to fire from the archers and the gunners, and he likely spoke to both French and Genoese sources. This was one of the first times that artillery had been used on the battlefield, and so the effect combined with the hail of arrows was undoubtedly terrifying. And at this point, I'll rate the factors that contributed to the Longbowmen's victory. The most important factor was probably numbers. There were about 6,000 crossbowmen maximum, as we discussed in the first video. Only 2,000 or so of those were Genoese at most. If we refuse to accept that levies joined the Genoese mercenaries, then there were only 2,000 crossbowmen total. The English had 6,000 longbowmen, once again assuming the reserve division didn't engage in this part of the fighting. The levies would have been worth far less in terms of combat power than the Genoese or the longbowmen, and so the numbers were heavily skewed even if they appeared equal on paper. The second issue is the setting sun. Shooting directly at a target with the sun in your eyes is difficult at best, and even if the crossbows were vastly superior weapons in every way, they'd have struggled to make an impact under those conditions. The third factor would have been the shooting speed. While this played a role, even if the crossbow shot twice as fast, I don't think it would have changed the outcome with the sun and the numerical factors. The fourth would be the pavises. Well, these were important. There were usually 2 to 3 crossbowmen to a pavis, and they couldn't all take cover behind it at the same time. Thus, their numbers would have been whittled down pretty quickly anyway, given the number of arrows the longbowmen were shooting. I don't think range played much of a factor at all, since 150 meters would be comfortably within the range of the longbow and most of the crossbows. So, while people talk about this a lot, I don't think it really impacted this fight much. These factors all combine to create a huge disadvantage for the Genoese, and as professionals, they likely realized this. Either on their own initiative or under orders from Doria, they began to retreat, and this retreat ran them straight into the French men at arms, and this is another major controversy. Tradition says that the French lords and knights were so angered at the cowardice of the Genoese that the king himself ordered his men to, quote, slay these rascals. Modern historians dispute this, saying that the Genoese were valuable mercenaries and that the king and Alençon would not kill them out of hand. As I said in the first episode, this fails to consider the bad blood that probably existed due to the previous Genoese mutiny. However, I tend to agree that the riding down of crossbowmen was not deliberate. Most sources state the French men-at-arms were pressing closely behind the Genoese, and remember that this is a narrow battlefield. As the crossbowmen start to fall back, they likely become entangled with the advancing men-at-arms. If this entanglement happened at 150 or 200 meters from the English lines, then this would be right where the horses are trying to go from a trot to a canter to rapidly close with the enemy. And this is likely what happened, since most chroniclers talk about the English shooting into this confused mass. In this scenario, the men-at-arms would have had no choice other than to ride down the crossbowmen. Some men-at-arms, perhaps remembering the Genoese mutiny from a few years ago, might indeed have drawn their swords to hack at them. This would have been foolish, since it would have meant discarding the lances that they needed for the charge, but people stuck in a traffic jam aren't known for rational thinking, and this was very much a medieval traffic jam with the added stressor of English arrows raining down. Within a short period of time, the crossbowmen had been devastated, and by the end of the day, the longbow stood victorious on the battlefield. But did the longbow really sweep the crossbow off of the battlefield altogether? Well, the answer to that is no, and here's why. While a lot of historians point out that after Crecy we don't see Genoese crossbowmen in French armies again, this fails to consider events in Italy and the Mediterranean. In 1347, the Black Death struck Genoa, killing tens of thousands of people. In 1350, Genoa faced off against the combined forces of Venice, Aragon, and the Byzantine Empire, meaning that most Genoese men were probably busy defending the Republic. In 1353, Genoa was defeated at Alghero, and in 1378 they were back at war with Venice, a war that they lost. Finally, in 1403, Genoa was decisively defeated by the Venetians at Modon. All this points to the fact that the Republic was probably too busy defending itself and its far-flung colonies to send large contingents of its best soldiers to fight in France. Moreover, crossbowmen continued to be a staple in most European armies. While the French experimented with the longbow, they still employed crossbowmen, and over 100 years after Crecy, the elite Spanish tercios also contained large numbers of crossbowmen, at least to start. In fact, the crossbow remained ubiquitous across Europe until it was definitively replaced by firearms. As Tomaso, you were fortunate enough to escape the slaughter. While others ran right back into the men-at-arms, you did the intelligent thing and scrambled down the embankment with a handful of others. Unfortunately, your friend and Pavisari, Enrico, along with most of your comrades, are dead on the field of battle. As you scramble away, you watch with horror as thousands of French men-at-arms and many nobles, including the King of Bohemia, are cut down. You might feel a brief sense of satisfaction, as the Count of Alençon, the man who called you scoundrels, is also felled, but any satisfaction is quickly tempered as you grasp the scale of the disaster. Astutely, you realize it's probably not a good idea to go and try to collect your wages from the French king, so you head back home to Genoa. Within a few years, you start to hear the stories about how the cowardice of the Genoese, your fallen comrades, betrayed the flower of French chivalry, and no matter how often you point out that it was the poor discipline of those French knights and their lords that led to the disaster, no one will listen to a lowly crossbowman. So you watch, sadly, as history is rewritten before your eyes. thank you for joining us for this video. If you enjoyed this content, please let me know by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. As always, nothing I say is meant to be definitive. My goal is to bring forward information and ideas to spark debate and discussion, which I think are the two best ways to learn about history. With that said, I hope you enjoyed, and take care until the next time.